Welcome. Good morning. I'm Doug Bundy, your host on Voices from the Dust TV this Tuesday, the 25th day of August, 2015. We welcome you to our show where we share the reason for the hope within us, the reason why the Latter-day Saints are Christians, and of course, the reason why you should be too. We not only explain what distinguishes LDS Christian doctrine from non-LDS Christian doctrine, but also why we declare that the only salvation remaining for the Gentiles is for them to repent and to be baptized and thus to be identified in the same covenant and to worship at the same altar as Israel. It's been 2 years now that we've been discussing these things. You can access all of our past episodes on our website, voicesfromthedust.org. That's voicesfromthedust.org. Just go there and click on the menu item TV, and you can watch the program live there, or you can click on one of the links provided for our YouTube channel and our Google Plus page, as well as our Facebook page, which are all entitled Voices from the Dust. Now, this is quite the anniversary for us, 2 years. It's not much for those who've been on radio and TV for some time, for many years, but I really didn't expect to make it this long with our show Voices from the Dust. But we are continuing to plug on. I don't know how long we'll be able to do it, but it's been quite an experience, to say the least. We used to broadcast every day, Monday through Friday, but we had to back off on that after a year or so and just do once a week program. And that's hard enough. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about Joseph Smith and his stones. Last week, my friend Jonathan Streeter asked me if I would be doing a show on the Joseph Smith seer stone, which has been in the news lately after the church released photographs of it, to everyone's astonishment. At first, I thought, what is there to say about it other than the fact that it shatters the illusions of some naive Latter-day Saints who didn't know anything about it? But then I realized it's really not the stone itself, but it's not about the stone itself, but it's about the boy, Joseph, who discovered it and how, and his story and how it changed him and his reaction and relationship with the community around him. Others have reportedly seen things in stones, both before and after Joseph found his, including his older brother Alvin, who died later and early on, but also his father. And but none of them announced to the world that what he saw in the stones would change the world forever, and then was able to deliver on that promise. And so that's really the story of the seer stone, not so much that it might have been used to translate the Book of Mormon, but the fact that the result of that work has changed the world, turning it upside down. And of course, it's scarcely begun. But the story actually begins innocently enough in 1820, 22 time frame, depending on who you're believing in the historical department. But during that time frame, from 1820 to 1822, between the time of his first vision in 1820, we could say, and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, or a year before that in 1822, Joseph was hard at work helping to dig a well for one of his neighbors, Willard Chase. And as they dug, they found this stone, which was not the first one Joseph had, but it turned out to be his favorite in the end. And it's the one that was photographed and displayed for all the world to see here just a few weeks ago. We can imagine, though, how as a teenager in a day when the folks of early 19th century America, just before the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, were very much into supernatural, sometimes superstitious tales and adventures that were full of sprites and spirits and buried treasures and magical enchantments and so on. And we could imagine then how Joseph's family would get caught up in the excitement of all of this as well. Indeed, he confesses his youthful recklessness in his history when he writes, "I was left to all kinds of temptations and mingling with all kinds of society. I frequently," this is all before 1823, during this period of 1820, this couple of years between the time that he had his first vision and the community reacted to it so negatively, and the time when he had his second vision, when he was shown that there were gold plates deposited in a hill nearby Palmyra. But anyway, he says, "I frequently fell into many foolish errors and displayed the weakness of youth and the foibles of human nature," he says, "which I am sorry to say led me to divers temptations, offensive in the sight of God. And in making this confession, though, no one need suppose me guilty of any great or malignant sins. A disposition to commit such was never in my nature, but I was guilty of levity, and sometimes associated with jovial company, etc., not consistent with that character which ought to be maintained by one who is called of God, as I had been. But this will not seem very strange to anyone who recollects my youth and is acquainted with my native cheery temperament." Close quote. Well, at the same time, it's important to point out that Joseph's sharing of his vision of God with religious leaders after his 1820 vision as a 14-year-old boy had caused them, the leaders of the community, to excite the public mind against him and create a bitter persecution. And it was common among all the sects. They all united to prosecute him, or to persecute him, prosecute as well. He had many vexatious lawsuits eventually during the course of all this, but all united to persecute him from that point on, which persecution hasn't ceased to this very day. It continues. And we'll talk maybe a little about that before we're through here today. But not only did they seek every opportunity to condemn him for what he said he saw, but also for what he was, a poor, obscure, uneducated, we might add superstitious, inevitably, son of a poor, obscure, and uneducated father and mother, whose children were under the necessity of laboring with their hands, hiring out by day's work and otherwise, as they could get opportunity to earn a little money for their household. Sometimes they were at home, Joseph writes, and sometimes abroad, and only by continuous labor were they enabled to get a comfortable maintenance, as he gives us in his account a decade and a half later in 1838. Well, who was it I heard talking about the fact, I think it was Sean McCraney. No, it wouldn't have been him. I don't know now. But the fact that in their journal, they wrote that they cleared 30 acres. In those days, there were trees everywhere, and the unbelievable labor that they would have had to do to clear 30 acres in the time frame that they said, I think it was in a year, or maybe I'm mistaken. It just came off the top of my head. I remember seeing it. I didn't plan on using it. But the fact that they cleared these 30 acres, just amazing if you know how much work that takes. But they were nevertheless accused of being indolent, and rather than working, they would rather find treasure, buried treasure and stuff. All these stories, as we'll see, were built up around the fact that Joseph Smith was born into this kind of a superstitious, magical belief in magic kind of family, and indeed nation and era of that time frame. There were many people who believed in those kinds of things. Because remember, it was before the Industrial Revolution and before even people understood what a negative number was in mathematics. They didn't understand what a vector was. All that was coined later by Sir Roland Hamilton, and that became the foundation of our modern science and technology. But that's another story. But this is all before that happening, and it's not hard to understand this picture. The excitement at times that probably filled this young man full of life and vinegar, vim and vinegar, as they say, was no doubt hard to contain for him when he shared with his friends the gifts that he discovered he had and he wanted to have. But then it must have also been difficult to bear the scorn of public condemnation, which the religious leaders of his community were heaping upon him. They combined to denounce him at the same time when he was very enthusiastic about life and things that were around him and so on. So unlike our day, when prosperity and the advances of science and technology have relegated supernatural things to the backwaters of society's preoccupations, where these things and also the wisdom and understanding of the things of God are allowed to stagnate. In Joseph's day, in contrast, these were the very things that were at the forefront of people's thoughts and at the vanguard of society's concerns. So we have to try to understand this environment if we're going to understand the story of Joseph Smith, which this new revelation of the seer stone and the publication of the photographs of it and its reality brings about. So a boy like Joseph in the 1820s, discovering the existence of extraordinary powers of the mind and spirit that he found within his own soul, and living in such a vibrant milieu of enthusiastic liberty and the free exploration of thought, it could be expected to indulge his fancy somewhat and to engage in the immature exercise of his gifts. In fact, if that were not the case, it would be more surprising than if, as it were, these natural tendencies he called temptations, but he soon grew out of them, unlike some of his friends whose minds continued to be obsessed with the prospect of escaping the poverty of the frontier if only they could find the buried treasures of pirates and Indians and legendary things that they continued to pursue. And you'll also remember that later on, when the golden plates were uncovered, and it was rumored about that Joseph had them in his possession, they were very anxious to try to get at him because of the tremendous value that they would have had. And they thought that he had cheated them when he found these things, and did not share them with him, because he was saying God would not let him share them with people and allow the public to see them and so on. And so that just fed into their belief that he had cheated them. And so they were very anxious to get a hold of their share as they considered it. And so they were like so many of today's poor and uneducated people who are trapped by their vain dreams of winning the lottery by buying their tickets at the corner store and so on, and then are eventually sometimes sucked into criminal activities. This is all part of this as the story. It's changed quite a bit in our day, but it's not hard to understand. Joseph no doubt felt guilty because, unlike his friends, he should have known better and to do these kinds of things. And he knew that God lives, for he saw him, and he knew that he had a work for him to do, for God told him so. And he also knew that the religious leaders who were persecuting him were corrupt and hypocritical, because God himself had told him that was the case. So you can imagine how maybe, he tried to fight back somewhat, right? Like you expect, you could almost imagine. He maybe was ridiculing them and joining in a jovial manner with his friends, and the things that they were doing is sort of set up this division of them against us. And you can see just how a lot of rebellious kids, even today, gravitate to that mentality through their angst, actually. But Joseph, had this in the back of his mind, that he knew that he had seen God, and he knew there was something, really serious that he had to do that was part of his calling in life. So it caused him much reflection and grief and suffering, unlike his partners. And he kept himself aloof from the different religions and things. That didn't help any, and they were probably unable to understand the things that he was going through. But he had seen through the religious pretenses of the pastors and ministers at their gatherings, when convert would contend against convert, and zealous clergy caused scenes of great confusion and bad feelings over the merit of various sects, while they contended for converts in a tumultuous strife of words and a contest about opinions. He saw all of that before he went to the woods to pray and ask God which one of these sects he ought to belong to, and was surprised by the vision that he was given. But so all of this was in his mind. He could see on the one hand how God was saying that he shouldn't join any of them, that they were all corrupt, and that he would, he didn't tell us all the things that were said in that vision, but he was given to understand that the Lord was going to call upon him to do something about all this mess, and then he could actually see it, or had seen it before he went into the woods firsthand. And of course, it hasn't stopped to this day. The creedal Christians continue the strife of words and the contest over opinions right up until our time, as we have shown many times on this program. Whether it's opinions over the place of Israel in God's plan, or over the doctrine of Christ concerning salvation and the existence and the nature of heaven and hell, or even the tenets of the so-called rapture. We saw a lot of that, right? How they're quarreling and angry with one another over that, because now as things are getting really bad, these people that believe that God's going to waft them away because they've confessed his name with their mouths and believed with him in their hearts, that they're not going to have to go through this great tribulation. And others realize that that is bogus, and that they're going to have to be ready, get ready for things that are coming according to biblical prophecy. But all of that is, depends on which ones you listen to. There's a great division concerning that and other kinds of doctrines. And the converts to these various ways of thinking and their clergy are just as much as at odds with one another in our day as they ever were in the days of Joseph. That's my point. However, for Joseph, knowing that he knew about the living God and having experienced the reality of the supernatural in the most personal and powerful way with those stones, and in the exuberance of a youthful naivete, which he shared with his family and his friends, the condemnation of the community's authorities for insisting that he had seen a vision must have constituted a really difficult and perplexing nexus of powerful forces in his life, bearing down on his self-esteem on one hand, and his sense of worth before God on the other, and the reality of what he actually saw on the other, and the lack of understanding among his friends, and so on. It was really quite an experience for a man, not a man, a boy. Again, we're talking 15, 16 years old during this period of time. He was 14 when he had the vision. in the spring of 1820. And then in the next spring, he was 15. And 2 years later, in 1822, he was only 16 years old. So, and yet he still had another year to go when he's 17, or just before his 17th birthday, when he would receive the second series of visions, the second vision with the angel Moroni. So this is terrific for this guy to go through. He writes a little bit about it, but of course, if you could sit down with him and he could tell you in detail, you can imagine what he might have been going through. I mean, you have to imagine it since it's not recorded anywhere, but I can imagine it knowing the things that I do about life and people and issues of religion that we're dealing with even as we speak. But in his 1838 history, 18 years after his first vision, after he had risen to a place of prominence among the saints and left the people of Palmyra that were so incensed against him, and was an honored leader among the saints, he writes the following. He says, "They were persecuting me." Now, how great it would be to understand the particular instances of their persecution against him. But he says, they were persecuting me, reviling me. What is it that they said when they reviled him? Can you imagine? If you go on Facebook and try to defend him, you can find out. Man alive, and they used filthy language and have no hesitation in expressing their bitterness and anger in some of them. It's just unreal. And I've experienced it, just a taste of it. But you can imagine for years here, they were persecuting him as a teenager, reviling him and speaking all manner against me falsely, he says, for saying I had seen a vision. For saying he had seen a vision. These are Christians that are doing this. But see, according to their creeds, there is no more revelation. There are no more apostles, and there are no more prophets. You can't have had a vision because there are no such things. All these things have been done away with. But he was led to say in his heart, he writes, "Why persecute me for telling the truth? I have actually seen a vision, and who am I that I can withstand God? Or why does the world think to make me deny what I've actually seen? For I had seen a vision. I knew it, and I knew that God knew it, and I could not deny it, neither dared I do it. At least I knew that by so doing, I would offend God and come under condemnation." Close quote. We don't have the historical details of the false and evil accusations that were leveled against him, but there are always two sides to a story. When Joseph told his story, it was from his perspective of faith and innocence. However, when the Creedals told the same story, it was from the perspective of unbelief and accusations of evil and guilt. Now, just what a 14-year-old boy could be, or even a 16-year-old a 16-year-old boy could be involved in back in those days, things that he could be guilty of that would be sufficient enough to excite the public mind against him must have been hard to come by, at least at first. But soon enough, it was clear that a powerful pretext could be found in his family's poverty and their superstition, and Joseph's teenage foibles, and the temptations to be rowdy and rebellious against the society, against the community that was bent on condemning him for what he knew was the truth. Man, I've seen too many teenagers not to know how that would go down. You could just see it. Somebody ought to make a movie from that perspective. Well, today we can easily see that these two perspectives were the seeds that have grown into two opposing groups. One group consisting of the Mormons retelling the story from the perspective of faith and innocence, and the other group that is vehemently opposed to the Mormons, consisting of the creedal Christians and the Mormon apostates, who retell the story now from the perspective of unbelief and accusations of evil that arose from the beginning. Well, that's what we kind of want to look at, because it revolves around today this idea of the stone. This Joseph Stones, what stones he had. We have labeled our program today, and of course there's some subtle meaning to that as well, given the more crass vernacular that unfortunately we have become acquainted with in these latter days. But nevertheless, it's amazing to understand it, but we need to understand it from the perspective of both sides. I mean, we can see the one side, which they, each side accuses the other of hiding things. And that's the important thing we want to say. If you want to know and understand the truth, then you have to be able to look at both sides and understand their motives as well as their claims and so on. So let's begin first this morning by viewing a video clip from the Mormon perspective. Here we see the story of how Joseph decided to ask God which church of creedal Christianity he should join. So we will play that now and talk about it after.
I'm so glad you came with us.
In my 15th year, there was in the place where we lived an unusual excitement on the subject of religion that became general among all the sects in that region of the country.
We'll have the good pleasure of hearing from one of the finest preachers in the state of New York, Reverend Bailey.
Without any fancy...
Indeed, the whole district seemed affected by it, and great multitudes united themselves to the different religious parties, which created no small stir and division amongst the people, some crying low here, and others low there.
Or we were damned. That's all there is to it.
Saved or damned? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. For he is the rewarder of them that diligently seek him.
Saved by grace, not by works.
But I don't believe one word he said.
But it was straight from the Bible.
He interpreted the Bible. The Bible is not a private interpretation.
So you're interested in religion. Which church do you have in mind to join?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure which is the true church.
Young man, all churches are true, so long as they teach Christ.
But they disagree and contradict each other.
Will you pray with all your power as we try to preach the word? Christ will burn himself and serve us with sweet manna all around.
Right now is the time for you to declare your faith by baptism as to whose side you are really on. The Lord's or the devil's?
I'm a sinner. I need the Lord.
Brother, I want to give my soul to God.
Oh, yeah.
I believe.
During this time of great excitement, my mind was called up to serious reflection and great uneasiness, considering that all could not be right, and that God could not be the author of so much confusion. I determined to investigate the subject more fully.
One Lord, one faith, and one baptism. One baptism, not three different ways. It says right here, one faith. But why do all the churches differ so much? And if the truth is in the Bible, why do they interpret the same scripture to mean so many different things? And if there's one Lord, and one faith, and one baptism, why are there so many churches?
Hiram, Samuel, look out of the way! Here comes the tree! Look out!
So great were the confusion and strife among the different denominations that it was impossible for a person young as I was, and so unacquainted with men and things, to come to any certain conclusion who was right and who was wrong. But though my feelings were deep and often poignant, still I kept myself aloof from all these parties. Though I attended their several meetings as often as occasion would permit. While I was laboring under the extreme difficulties caused by the contests of these parties of religionists, I was one day reading the Epistle of James, 1st chapter and 5th verse.
If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering.
If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. Never did any passage of Scripture come with more power to the heart of man than this did at this time to mine. It seemed to enter with great force into every feeling of my heart. I reflected on it again and again, knowing that if any person needed wisdom from God, I did.
If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. In faith, that's the answer. To ask of God with real faith. And I will.
So according to Joseph, he was driven to the conclusion to ask of God in faith because he found that he could not solve his dilemma in any other way. The video does not use all the words of Joseph in his history to explain the dilemma he was in, but shows the essence of some parts of it in the scenes of the religious meetings, right? The use of dramatic scenes we might call poetic license. It is not meant to deceive by leaving out the explicit words of Joseph's history, where he describes in detail his thoughts and experiences with the religious community at the time, but it's meant to effectively convey the same idea in another more effective, non-literal way. The difference is akin to what is known as lyricism in literature, music, and poetry, where certain fictional expressions are substituted for a literal recitation of a narrative in order to evoke the emotion associated with the narrative, which relates the essence of the literal text more effectively and efficiently. We're used to that. We see that. This is an art that is very familiar in our generation, which has been raised on television and movies. You can't repeat. If a movie is based on a book, you can't repeat exactly what put the book, the narrative, the textual narrative, word for word into the book. You've got to interpret. It's got to be different because it's a different medium. You've got to convey what you want to convey, the idea of the book, and that's why people go to see the movie, because they like the book, and sometimes they get disappointed. But the point is, it's in order to convey the message, it's different than what the written word would be, word for word. And we see that in this little clip. what's left out? Well, there's a lot of details that are left out. As a matter of fact, it's not even, it says Joseph's own words, but they're not just his 1838 history, the words of his 1838 history, but later on in the Wentworth letter, he wrote to the Chicago newspaper, and he was explaining again in different words. And so the script here uses his words. They don't tell you, but they go between the two accounts, the 1838 account, which they pick and choose from, and also the Wentworth letter that they pick and choose from. And but they have to do these things in order to effectively and efficiently convey the message of the movie, which is his experience, his story, see? So that has to be understood. It's an art that's familiar to all of us because we've been raised in a period of time when these things have been used over and over again. We've been raised on television and movies, and we see that happens. But in producing movies, videos, and musicals and literature about the story of Joseph Smith, the use of lyricism can backfire, and it has, because the opponents of the Mormons, the creedals as we call them, can use it against them now to say that they were hiding the truth. See, that video clip that we just watched doesn't say anything about the superstitious and magical things that Joseph and his family and his friends, and indeed a large part of the community, were involved in at the time. It's been sanitized, if you will, and cleaned up, because they're not showing that, and because it's not germane to the actual story. It might be interesting, but it would just detract, and they'd never get that approved, because you understand this is to be presented to the world so that they will go before the Lord and ask if Joseph Smith was truly a prophet of God. Now, how likely are they to ask if all the details were included? I don't think it's likely, but you can see that it would not have been a deceitful thing for the church to do what they have done in producing their materials, to leave those kinds of things out. See? But we would get a lot of argument from people, but let's go on. We can see that this then provides a opportunity for the cunning of the devil to use a tactic in connection with the story of the seer stone that has now emerged. Evidently, Joseph preferred to use his stone that he found when they were digging the well for Willard Chase, and his daughter, who had a similar stone. And it was by that means that they found the stone that Joseph kept, and eventually was shown the other day. Photographs of it were shown the other day by the church. So that's the stone, but he found it by means of Chase's daughter's stone, and she had a stone. So all of this stuff, you have to understand, would have had to be unpacked in a very careful way, given that stuff has now part of our past and we don't understand it. When I was born, it was in the middle of World War II. There were airplanes flying. There were radios communicating through the air. There was television that was starting to be understood. Radar had come on the scene in a primitive form, and of course the automobiles and all the different things that are part of our technology that we have grown up with, that would amaze those people. We actually carry around, each one of us, a stone ourselves that we can use to communicate, not only find lost things, but search knowledge, that more knowledge than was ever in a library, in any one library in the world, probably. But the point is that we understand it, so we take it for granted, but we don't understand the things that Joseph was involved in, and we tend to relegate that kind of stuff to arts of darkness and so on. But so we need to understand this. Well, anyway, this then enables them to use, the enemies of the Mormons, to use this as a cunning tactic in connection with the seer stone, because Joseph evidently preferred to use this stone in the translation process that later becomes part of the story, because it was more practical, more convenient than using the so-called spectacles that were reportedly bundled with the plates. I say reportedly because there are those who've made the case that the stone spectacles may have never even existed, but were invented in order to avoid the appearance of the involvement of these superstitious and magical stones that had been charged. Let me back up. They were invented, they contend, in order to avoid the appearance of involvement of superstition and magic that has been charged to Joseph, and used to great effect by the creedal opponents of the Mormons in discrediting the report of Joseph's vision of God. So we're going to see how that works, but I think you can imagine it's not really all that hard. In today's environment, especially, prove that some guy was involved with magical stones and superstitions and carried a talisman and believed in that he could see things that others couldn't see, and so on. It would be easy then to, once you convince people of that, to convince them of the fact that he was a conniving fraud and his religion was bogus, as they wrote in the Salt Lake Tribune here just a few weeks ago. So in this creedal version of the story, this discrediting of the story, we should say, I guess, by the time Joseph wrote in his 1838 account, the story of the two stones in silver bows fastened to a breastplate, constituting what is called the Urim and Thummim, was made out of whole cloth, according to them, see, in order to lend legitimacy to the Mormon version of the story, of the tale, they would say. So in order to beguile people, they made up this story that there were interpreters provided by God for interpreting the writing on the plates of gold that ended up being the Book of Mormon. And the idea of doing that was to divert people's attention from the superstition and magic that surrounds the use of the stones. But when you think about it, what difference does it make whether you use stones that were fastened in silver bows, or maybe a stone that you found at the bottom of a well, or that you dug up when you were digging a well? The big part of that is that one lends more credence, is more religious, is tied to the Bible, and the other is tied to magic and superstition, and therefore more unlikely to be believed. Of course, as the time went by, the Mormons became a larger, more organized, determined, and powerful group than the creedal group, and they produced movies and videos and literature teaching their version of the story to their own people, as well as relating it to investigators around the world. This then led to a lot of trying to get the story out, and what now is they're accused of sanitizing the story, because they show a different view than what we find out is actually the case. It's like packaging sausage after it's made in a nice and beautiful and attractive package. But if people who were buying it saw how it was made, they may not be so motivated to buy it. Kind of a crude analogy, but it's the same principle involved, isn't it? So this was the fact, though, that the church could produce movies because they became a large and powerful church, an organization with many people contributing to the church. They could then provide the missionary materials that they did in terms of movies and videos and literature of all kinds, manuals and so on, and hire sculptors to sculpt statues and provide visitor centers with theaters to show the movies and hire artists and all kinds of skilled people to put their story together. But again, the story is from the point of view of these people would be sanitized because it doesn't go into this superstitious and magic angle that was actually the case. But all of this then changes with the advent of the internet and social media. I wish I had somebody to discuss this with. It would be a lot better, but somehow we haven't been able to put that together yet. But anyway, if you can bear with me, the advent of the internet and social media took away this advantage of the church, being a large corporation that could afford things, because now anybody on the internet can produce a movie or a video like we're producing and make the playing field more level because of the ubiquitous access to worldwide publishing that's now available to everybody. Maybe they can't do it in the same way with the same finesse and with the same resources that are available to the church, but they can certainly do enough to bring people to a knowledge of the things that the church has left out in telling the story. So the creedals are now able to publish their case on the internet without the need for expensive infrastructure, and so as a result they've gone to it with a vengeance and actually forced the church to go back and revisit some of the aspects of these stories. Their version, the creedal version of the story, emphasized the earlier characterizations of Joseph's family and friends as a superstitious bunch involved in magic and divination. We saw, or we will see, Sean McCraney talking about here that he actually saw in modern times, divination with a divining rod. And the Mormon group had ignored this aspect of things in their telling of the story over 2 centuries almost, for obvious reasons. True, it was a repetition of the early tactics of the creedal contemporaries of Joseph to be emphasizing these things, but now it could be retold with the added advantage with the long history of the Mormons publishing of their story in front of everybody. So in other words, this is a real cunning tactic. Now we can bring up these things that were not told. Now we can bring up these things that were suppressed, it could be said, or that were hidden, even though it wasn't true. A lot of this stuff came out in church magazines from time to time. The church history library was available to historians. It's not like they had suppressed it or hidden it. It's like they couldn't tell everything, and they're going to leave out these things that they saw as detrimental to the story, or that could be twisted to be detrimental in the story, like had happened in the early days of the church. And so that's just, who wouldn't have done that? It's not that they were deceitful or that these men were evil and wicked and full of hypocrisy and doing this. It's just crazy. But it's the cunning of the devil that's managed to make that story stick with a lot of people. And the advantage which the church had is now gone with the internet. And the advantage is swung to the creedal Christians in trying to deny the story of Joseph Smith and being able to show now that the long history of Mormons publishing their story provided them with proof in the minds of the weak, I guess. In other words, their telling of the story can now be easily mischaracterized as deceitful, and that it has been. This is a powerful, if unfair advantage, which is typical of the cunning of the devil. That Joseph used a seer stone is true. That his family was poverty-stricken and superstitious is also true. That Joseph, his family, and friends indulged immaturely in things of the occult is true as well. But using these truths to discredit the truth of his divine encounters with God and angels is just devilish. Yet that's what we face. As now the Mormons can be looked upon as having egg on their face because they told the story using poetic license, as it were. Not dreaming that this day would come when people would retell their story and bring up all these other things and make it look as if the Mormons had been hiding it. Now, even Sean McCraney admits this. He's a bitter foe of the Mormon church. He's a Mormon apostate. I've been on his show. We've seen different things that he said. But here, he explains in his own words, he tells us how the Mormons have misled their own people with a sugar-coated, quote-unquote, version of the story, and how he is now telling the truth for their benefit so they can see beyond the sugar-coated version that the church teaches them. So you see them using that angle even here with Sean. Sean, oh my goodness, let me find it first. Okay, here it is.
So how do you choose to view these factual portraits? Now, I know they're not complete. And I mentioned to some guys today that I met with that I'm presenting the side of Mormon history that you don't typically hear. Now, I know the stuff with Emma, you hear a little bit more often in church, but I mean, not Emma, with Lucy Mack. But I present the side that you don't often hear to offset the sugar-coated single position side that you always hear in church. So if you're LDS, I'm trying to show you a side that you don't get when you just go to a Sunday school class or a priesthood meeting and hear it taught. I'm not pretending to say I know how these things factually measure up, but I am trying to say that I think they will give us a good idea of what the makeup was of Joseph Smith and his family. And in addition to her religious makeup and moralism, Lucy Mack Smith was, like her husband Joseph Sr. and like her son Joseph Jr., visionary and prophetic. She was a dreamer. And in fact, in 1803 or 1804, she was greatly troubled by her husband's resistance to join a church. She wanted them to join a church, and he refused to. And she had a dream where there's two trees and they're blowing in the wind. And she woke up and she interpreted this dream to believe that the wind was the truth, the Spirit of God, and that the one tree which was immovable was her brother-in-law, Jesse, who he refused to hear the truth. And on the other tree, which moved and blew in the wind, was her husband, Joseph Sr., and that he would someday embrace the gospel. I think it's very telling that when Joseph Smith established the true church back on the earth, that he wept greatly. He wept emotionally at the fact that his father was baptized into this church that he established. And I think it met a lot of unfulfilled needs that were going on in the Smith family with regard to religion. With a father as a stubborn universalist and a nagging habit for a bit of drink and magic, and a mother who secretly covenanted with God to spend her days searching for the true religion, the family was in need of something no less than a religious savior. In these conditions, Joseph Smith was born, as it were, and he became a prime candidate, all those things included that we talked about last week, as becoming the savior for the family and for the religions of the world. Jesus obviously hadn't done it for the Smith couple, Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack. He didn't come in and give them that regenerative experience that would have sufficed in a normal relationship. So they sought elsewhere for something more. Religion couldn't heal them. All it brought was division in their family. Something had to be done, and it seemed like Joseph Smith Jr. came at a time and in certain circumstances that was going to provide that. And in a sense, I believe he made himself their savior. so to speak. That's going to make some of you mad, but I don't mean it literally in the sense of that. And it's not surprising that I think it's the Broome County Courier on December 29th, 1831, actually referred to Joseph Smith as the second Messiah. So that all plays into the thing that he was going to do for the Christian church. I propose that the Book of Mormon and the establishment of the church in part was a response to the immediate needs of Joseph Smith's own family. I think that the announcement of seeing a vision of the Lord fit well into the psychological makeup of the mother. And I think that the announcement of this vision that all the churches were wrong pleased the Father. So Joseph Smith goes to a grove of trees to pray. And while he's in that grove of trees, he has a vision and he sees God. And then God tells him none of the churches were true. The mother would have completely resonated to Joseph having a vision of seeing God. And the father would have completely resonated to God saying none of the churches were true. So he satisfied both needs by doing that. I think that the announcement of buried gold plates gave the family future hope. It gave them something to look for. It fit right in the paradigm of the father going out and searching for gold himself. And indeed, Lucy Max Smith prayer of getting that religion, whether it is in the Bible or outside of it, would be fulfilled. I want you to also know that Lucy, when she went to a grove of trees to pray, and that's mentioned in her autobiography, that she went to this grove of trees. And it's fitting that the first vision also occurred in a grove of trees. And there's a number of similarities on that I want.
So Latter-day Saints, let me disabuse you of your sugar-coated version that doesn't tell you about these things, but let's start at the beginning and show how Joseph really was only trying to save his own family and help his mother and father reconcile the different dynamics that showed up in their lives. In other words, and he also noticed, Sean introduces this meme of being saved, but not necessarily being saved outside of a Christian church. See, this didn't come along till later, but you know, it was unheard of back then. In those days, this is not mentioned, but it's implicit, see, that Lucy didn't accept Jesus as her own personal savior. Well, that doctrine didn't come along. You had to belong to a Christian church. Why, all churches are true. All Christian churches are true that teach Christ. See, that was the thinking back then. There wasn't the idea that you could be saved by accepting Jesus as your personal savior, regardless of what denomination you belong to. That was something they developed later on, and we'll talk about that at some point. But here Sean makes a case for why the historical account of the Mormons is false. See, he admits that the case for the guilt by association with superstition and magic, along with the indolence and unworthiness of Joseph that it implies, is not in the final analysis worthwhile. So he kind of backs up into that, as we'll see here in this next clip, which I didn't rename. Dang it. How do I keep? I think this is it.
The evidence and information on Joseph Smith Jr. And his family being involved in folk magic is substantial. If you take the time and want to read a book that you can really gives you a lot of information, I've mentioned it before, look at D. Michael Quinn's book, Early Mormonism and the Magic World View. And if you do that, you're going to be blown away. I promise you, blown away by the preponderance of information about the magic, occultism, witchcraft, if you want to call it that, of Joseph Smith's early family, of Joseph Smith through his young life all the way up until about 1826, 1827. We know that the church came about in 1830, so that gives you kind of a time frame. But in my opinion, all this information, again, has to be properly understood if we're going to help bring people to the Lord. Now, I'm going to say some things that might sound a little different, but I just have to say it because this is what came to me as I prepared. I don't think the magic practices of the Smith family necessarily convict them of being frauds. I think that they are a piece of a puzzle. I think that they can be taken either way. There are far more important things, very substantial important things in Mormonism that prove that it is problematic and fraudulent and deceptive. The fact that they dabbled in these things isn't necessarily one of the big ones. So if you want to build a whole argument on the fact that Joseph Smith and his family got involved in this stuff, it's probably going to be a waste of your time. And let me give you a why, some answers why. In the cultural context of rural 19th century America, like in and around Palmyra, New York, where Joseph Smith and his family lived, magic practices and folklore rituals were very common. As mentioned, D. Michael Quinn wrote in Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, a very important factor in Palmyra's treasure digging of the 1820s is that the local newspaper endorsed it, okay? What did the local and even the national newspapers say about magical practices, searching for treasure, money digging, scrying, and all these things? In an 1822 column titled Money Diggers, the local newspaper in Palmyra, speaking of money digging, reported, quote, much, however, depends on the skillful use of the genuine mineral rod, unquote. The paper then told of a Vermont man who, quote, after digging with unyielding confidence and unabating diligence for 10 or 12 years, found a sufficient quantity of money to build him a commodious home for his own convenience and fill it with comforts for weary travelers, unquote.
Now, let me just pause it for there, because this is an important point to understand and to recognize. Here, this was during the very time that Joseph, between the 1820, as a 14-year-old boy, when he saw the vision that angered so many in the community, and the time in 1823 when the angel Moroni explained to him that there were gold plates deposited in a hill near his home. It was in between this period of time that all of this takes place, and you see it's legitimized by the newspaper. What poor family, and I've heard other descriptions of how poor the Smiths were. I mean, it was really poor, but who would have faulted them for trying to do what the newspaper is reporting as actually being worthwhile and as rewarding and as something legitimate? See, it's just ridiculous that they will take these stories that are later twisted to make Joseph look like somebody he isn't. And they were in the beginning not, it was not a behavior, this money digging and glass looking and all these terms that they use was actually something that was recognized as legitimate behavior, and even to an extent incentivized by the local newspaper. That's important to understand. People just roll over it, but we need to understand it. Let's continue with Sean here.
Same paper reported that another Vermonter dug up treasures in the sum of $50,000. A Massachusetts magazine published an article on folk magic in 1833, which read, quote, men of reputation and character whose intelligence would prevent a deception upon their own minds and whose known honesty forbids that suspicion of any attempt to lead them into error have used the art of discovering streams of water or veins of minerals beneath the surface of the earth by the mysterious properties of the hazel wand, unquote.
See, now Sean's going to tell us of a personal modern experience he had with this. And but yet here he's telling us this account in 1833, which spans, this is 3 years after the church was organized. And so you can see that there were, that it wasn't just, you can't just paint it with the same brush as the enemies of the church try to do to make Joseph Smith stand out as somebody totally untrustworthy and devious, because he was indulging in these same things that others were indulging in, and indeed had been reported as being successful. So that puts a whole different light on it.
Even a National Science Journal in 1826 reported on folk magic activities as though they were normative and ubiquitous in an area. Quinn quotes from the same article, which was
normative and ubiquitous. Those are two words that we need to emphasize. The superstition and the belief in magic was normal and ubiquitous.
Printed in a Vermont newspaper that said, we could name, if we pleased, at least 500 respectable men who do, in the simplicity of their hearts, verily believe that immense treasures lie concealed upon our green mountains, many of whom have been for a number of years most industriously and perseveringly engaged in digging it up. Some of them have succeeded beyond their most sanguine expectations. So we have from the newspapers of Joseph Smith's time and his family, of people outside of religion, inside religion, all walks of life, participating in these things. Remember, Joseph Smith and his father were hired by respected farmers and people who cultivated the land to come out to their property and use their techniques to find treasure. I think that speaks that it was a normative practice to occur at the time.
It does speak to that. And the fact that they wanted them to come and do that, even though a lot of times, or at least one time we know of, Joseph finally said he persuaded the old man Stoll to give up, that it wasn't going to work. So they weren't, but they were in extenuating circumstances, being so poor and being paid by these men to look for these things. How awful it is to mischaracterize that and call him a money digger and a glass looker who was deceiving people. See, that's the other part of the story. He was telling them that he could see the money, or he could see the treasure, but then it would slip away and so on like that. So they're able, the cunning of the devil, you have to understand how powerful it is. He can use the truth and partial truth to cunningly craft a tale that seems to be ironclad, but it's not. And but let's go on and hear what Sean has to say.
Now, maybe if you examine your own life, you might see, even in this day and age, some connection to folklore, beliefs, and magical ideation. My dad and my younger brother and I, several years ago, decided we were going to try to raise berries. And we got about a 2-acre plot of land in Hemet, California. And the first thing we wanted to do was dig a well. So my dad went to the local farmers and asked them if we could find somebody who would help us dig a well. And a guy came out, and you know what he did? He got this thing. He got these two, one in this hand, one in this hand. It looked like a Y upside down with the stick part down here. And he walked around for an hour on that land. And every time it started pointing down, he would say, dig here. And then you go to another place, he'd say, dig here. And we found water that way. Now, I watched him do it, and I thought it was the biggest con in the world. I was laughing my head off because I had read this stuff in church history, but still today, completely disconnected from Mormonism, this guy's out there finding water by doing this thing, you know? So we have strange practices in our lives as people. We have some superstitions.
Now, notice he characterizes it as strange and superstitious, but it worked. And there's not just the history of Joseph Smith, but the history of our entire country where they use divining rods to do these kinds of things. So it's not necessarily superstitious. If it works, it works. And we might not understand how it works, but there are people who have gifts to be able to use those kinds of things. So it's not fair to characterize them as superstitious and as deceptive.
Have you ever spilt salt on a table? Have you ever had someone say, quick, throw it over your shoulder? You know, have you ever stepped on a crack and thought of breaking your mother's back? Have you ever been on a ladder and had a black cat run across you? Or do you walk under ladders when they're open? All this stuff builds into folklore, traditional type stuff. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying try to look at it in the context, all right? The first week of my mission in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, we were knocking on doors and came to a member's house, and she opened the doors and she was completely frantic about something. And my companion, I was new, and what's wrong? What's wrong? And she said, a bird hit my window today and died. And my companion and I were, what? What does that mean? And she said, don't you know that means that someone in your family is going to die? And I mean, this was my first night out tracking, really. And so we walk away, my companion and I, and we're laughing about her and her mystical beliefs and think all this stuff. And during that week, in the morning, in the kitchen, this is in my journal from that time, I'm sitting there studying, and a bird hits the window. It's early in the morning, a few days later, and I go out and I see the birds laying there dead. And my mind thinks about this lady and this experience, and then I kind of laugh to myself. I get home that night, my mission president called, my grandpa died that day. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying that when things like that happen, it reinforces a belief that possibly it is true. And so people get involved in that kind of thing.
Especially back in Joseph Smith's day. They get involved in it in these days. But imagine what in these days of modern technology and science and so on. But imagine how much they got involved in the days of Joseph.
Most people, if they have been in and around long enough, have been exposed to families and their folklorish magical traditions. In rural America, even some of the best men and women were convinced that this was okay. It did not make them necessarily evil of the practices. It just showed that they were susceptible to the mystical beliefs of the day. Now that I've given all those justifications as to why not build a huge case against the Smiths for their use in practice, I'm going to share some things, documented things, that are going to help show that they were not just a typical Christian family when it came to these things. Ask yourself, how do these magic practices and events contribute to the makeup of Mormonism, and how do they contribute to the mindset and attitudes of Mormons today when it comes to knowledge, like we talked about last week?
Okay, I'm going to pause it there. I don't know if I'll play the rest of it, but he goes on to talk about a Peter Ingersoll affidavit, and there are many affidavits in the historical record, which is one of the many stories used to discredit Joseph Smith and his father. And he goes on to talk about it. I won't read it, and he reads it. I don't think we'll go into that much, but the fact is that it was sworn out before a judge of the same community that united against the prophet, that Ingersoll was approached by them, and they said that he could find treasure. It doesn't even really make a lot of sense when you think about it, because if they could find treasure without him, then why would they need him? You know, it doesn't make sense. But the affidavit goes on to say Peter Ingersoll says that they persuaded him to believe that they would follow him, he would find treasure. So they didn't, and he soon gave up on it and said, no, you're full of baloney and so on. But this was used as other statements that were gathered by Herbert, a guy by the name of Herbert, and enemies of Joseph Smith, for the express purpose of discrediting Joseph's story. You know, that has to be taken into account. The entire creedal community, including judges and officers of the law, etc., were united or was united against him. So proving a case to discredit him in the eyes of upstanding citizens outside that community is tainted from the get-go, because they were all united against him. And they felt self-righteous in doing so. So I won't call them self-righteous, but maybe that's not unjustified, but other people thinking of themselves as above these kinds of things in the community, which was by 1830s was beginning to happen, they might have quickly dismissed them, especially if they were the more educated and learned elements of the society. But Sean emphasizes the fact that these sworn stories of magic and superstition discrediting the prophet came out before Joseph announced the series of visions with the angel that revealed the deposit of gold plates. And he emphasizes that a couple of times. After the existence of the plates became known, the same community was even more outraged and determined to disabuse a world not acquainted with the true character of the prophet. So in other words, then after the plates came out and the knowledge of them was known about, then they could say, oh no, don't believe this guy is a fraud, this guy is a money digger, this guy is he went around, and here we have affidavits to prove that he was deceiving people, telling them that he was an actual, money digger, as successful money diggers were. See, that was the slant that they put on it. Not that he was a money digger, which they do today, but that he was a successful money digger when he, in fact, was not able to do as had been reported in a legitimate press. So see these little twists, these little slants on the actual story, given the cunning of the devil, can be twisted to make things look a lot different than what the truth shows. And this is clearly shown by the editor of the Palmyra Freeman, who wrote in August, the year before the Book of Mormon was published. It was published in 1830, and this was written in 1829. Quote, "The Golden Bible is the greatest piece of superstition that has ever come within the sphere of our knowledge," end quote. Now, if he's the editor of the Palmyra newspaper, then you see that what the mindset of the community was against Joseph. So it goes out from there. The story of the Golden Bible went viral even before it was published. We went viral in, using our own vernacular, but mainly because it was desired by the editors and publishers of Creedal Christianity to quash this, quote, greatest piece of superstition, unquote, before the public could be taken in by it. And how are they going to do that? By referring back to the time before the Book of Mormon came forth, before the account of the vision that revealed the deposit of the gold plates, and that way discredit the Smiths, and especially Joseph Smith. And that way, see, it could be established that the story of the plates was just a continuation of the stories of neighbors who were convinced that Joseph could help them find treasure, as others had found that they were reading about in their newspapers. So you see how that very easily twists Joseph into being this conniving fraud. So one of these accounts, the guy's name's Abram Willard Benton. He was a physician in Ohio in 1831, took upon himself to disabuse the public mind regarding the prophet by virtue of his insider knowledge. And he doesn't say how he gets this insider knowledge. I don't know whether I have to look later and search it a little more clearly, but I'm not sure whether he was a resident at one time of Palmyra, or is this secondhand stuff that he learned, because he really never says. But when a story of the Golden Bible appeared in Ohio, then this guy writes in and he says, and I'll quote it here, Messrs. Editors, sirs, we would say today, in the 6th number of your paper, I saw a notice of a sect of people called Mormonites, and thinking that a fuller history of the founder, Joseph Smith Jr., might be interesting to the community, and particularly to your correspondent in Ohio, evidently the guy that wrote the piece, where perhaps the truth concerning him may be hard to come at, I will take the trouble to make a few remarks on the character of that infamous impostor. For several years preceding the appearance of his book, he was about the country in the character of a glass looker, pretending by means of a certain stone or glass which he put in a hat to be able to discover lost goods, hidden treasures, mines of gold and silver, etc. Although he constantly failed in his pretensions, still he had his dupes who put implicit confidence in all his words. In this town, a wealthy farmer named Josiah Stoll, together with others, spent large sums of money in digging for hidden money, which this Smith pretended he could see, and told them where to dig, but they never found their treasure. At length, the public the public that was united against Joseph, becoming wearied with the base imposition which he was palming upon the credulity of the ignorant. Well, they weren't so ignorant if they were publishing reading the stories in the newspaper about those who were finding these kinds of treasures. It's not like they were ignorant in that sense to believe that it was possible. The point was not that it was there, that they didn't believe that it was possible. The point was whether Joseph was able to repeat what had been done in other areas of the country. So it really puts a different color to it when you understand that angle. So anyway, at length the public, becoming wearied with the base imposition which he was palming upon the credulity of the ignorant, for the purpose of sponging his living from their earnings. Sponging, see the words, the loaded words he uses throughout this reveal his agenda. See, he's convicted him of things, and he doesn't say, like I said, that he knows him personally or he's personally acquainted or even lived in the area when all that was happening. He may just be repeating the story that he's heard from others. But for the purpose of sponging his, you don't sponge your living from their earnings, because you got to get out and work, like clearing 30 acres of timber. That would not be sponging. But anyway, their digging, of course, is not sponging either. That's hard work as well. Have you ever tried to dig a well by hand? But anyway, this is how they mischaracterize everything to the intent of discrediting Joseph, ultimately because of his vision, not because he was hurting anybody. There were probably plenty of others who were around in the country doing the same kinds of things. Some of them might have been frauds from the beginning and had no gift, but Joseph believed that he really had a gift, and he was doing it in earnest and in good faith. But here they color it. For the purpose of sponging his living from their earnings, had him, okay, let me back up now, because at length the public, becoming wearied with the base imposition which he was palming upon the credulity of the ignorant, for the purpose of sponging his living from their earnings, see, this outraged them, had him arrested as a disorderly person, tried and condemned before a court of justice. This, people denied ever took place for a while, but I guess they found some records that were torn out of a record book, and there's some controversy about all of this, but an 1826 proceeding in which Joseph was arraigned before a judge, and he was eventually released because they couldn't come to a conclusion of whether he was really guilty of being a disorderly person, which they charged him with, and had him arrested for. But they tried, and it says here, and condemned before a court of justice. See, well, that was not true. He was tried, but he was not condemned. They actually released him on his own recognizance or something to that effect. But considering his youth, he says, but considering his youth, he then being a minor, and thinking he might reform his conduct, he was designedly allowed to escape. Oh my goodness. He just really, they accused the Mormons of being deceitful, but never raise a word against people that said things like this. No one ever gets upset that a man would describe this so-called trial in this way and describe Joseph with these words that are so loaded and never ever be affronted by it, never taking umbrage with what these people are saying. Or if they had lived back in their day and had read it in the newspaper, would this have caused them to go dig for the truth? It would for a lot of people. I know one in particular, I'll tell the story of sometime about a guy I went to BYU with, a Latter-day Saint, who from a Baptist, and when he was in a Baptist theological school, because of this very same thing, people that Joseph and using this kind of language and so forth that made him believe that, hey, he had to find out the truth. He was going to look into it because nobody could be 100% that bad. So anyway, he was designedly allowed to escape, not because, and he was found guilty. See, I mean, that's ridiculous. It's not the way it came out. This was 4 or 5 years ago. From this time, he absented himself from this place, returning only privately and holding clandestine intercourse with his credulous dupes for 2 or 3 years. Of course, referring to the fact that Joseph moved under commandment, moved the church to Kirtland, Ohio, and others that would go from Colesville, New York, would travel to Missouri, following Oliver Cowdery and so on. But anyway, of course, anybody reading this wouldn't have any idea of what went on among the saints that caused them to move, and also wouldn't understand the revelations that were so moving that they received concerning these things. Anyway, that whole part of the story is missing. You're only getting, if Sean calls the Mormon story sugar-coated, then this is, what would we call this? Vinegar-coated? I don't know exactly. Maybe I'll come up with a better term, but that's exactly what it is. It was during this time, and probably by the help of others more skilled in the way of iniquity than himself, that he formed the blasphemous design of forging a new revelation, which, backed by the terrors of an endless hell and the testimony of base, unprincipled men, he hoped would frighten the ignorant and open a field of speculation for the vicious, so that he might secure to himself the scandalous honor of being the founder of a new sect, which might rival perhaps the Wilkinsonians or the French prophets of the 17th century. Man, this is stuff that people ought to make a movie out of. What kind of people do this sort of thing? During the past summer of 1830, he was frequently in this vicinity. Now, this vicinity is another vicinity of New York. I think it was St. Bainbridge. Is that in New York? It does. I'm not sure, again, exactly where it's located. He was frequently in this vicinity and others of the baser sort, as Oliver Cowdery, Whitmer, etc., holding meetings and proselyting a few weeks misspelled there, and silly women, and still more silly men, whose minds are shrouded in a mist of ignorance, which no ray can penetrate, and whose credulity the utmost absurdity cannot equal. In order to check the progress of delusion and open the eyes and understandings of those who blindly followed him, and unmask the turpitude and villainy of those who knowingly abetted him in his infamous designs, he was again arraigned before a bar of justice during last summer to answer to a charge of misdemeanor. This trial led to an investigation of his character and conduct, which clearly evinced to the unprejudiced whence the spirit came which dictated his inspirations. During the trial, it was shown that the Book of Mormon was brought to light by the same magic power by which he pretended to tell fortunes, discover hidden treasures, etc. Oliver Cowdery, one of the 3 witnesses to the book, testified under oath that said Smith found with the plates from which he translated his book 2 transparent stones resembling glass set in silver bowls, that by looking through these he was able to read in English the reformed Egyptian characters which were engraved on the plates. So much for the gift and power of God, by which Smith says he translated his book. 2 transparent stones, undoubtedly of the same properties and the gift of the same Spirit as the one in which he looked to find his neighbor's goods. It is reported, and probably true, that he commenced his juggling by stealing and hiding property belonging to his neighbors, and when inquiry was made, he would look in his stone, his gift and power, and tell where it was. Josiah Stoll, a Mormonite, being sworn, testified that he positively knew that said Smith never had lied to or deceived him, and did not believe he ever tried to deceive anybody else. The following questions were asked him, to which he made the replies annexed. Did Smith ever tell you there was money hidden in a certain place which he mentioned? Yes. Did he tell you you could find it by digging? Yes. Did you dig? Yes. Did you find any money? No. Did he not lie to you then and deceive you? No. The money was there, but we did not get quite to it. How do you know it was there? Smith said it was. Addison Austin was next called upon, who testified that at the very same time that Stoll was digging for money, he, Austin, was in company with said Smith alone, and asked him to tell him honestly whether he could see this money or not. Smith hesitated some time, but finally replied, quote, "To be candid, between you and me, I cannot any more than you or anybody else, but any way to get a living," end quote. Here then we have his own confession that he was a vile, dishonest impostor. As regards the testimony of Josiah Stoll, it needs no comment. He swore positively that Smith did not lie to him. So much for a Mormon witness. Paramount to this in truth and consistency was the testimony of Joseph Knight, another Mormonite. Newell Knight, son of the former, and also a Mormonite, testified under an oath that he positively had a devil cast out of himself by the instrumentality of Joseph Smith Jr., and that he saw the devil after it was out, but could not tell how it looked. Those who join them in this place are without exception children who are frightened into the measure, or ignorant adults whose love for the marvelous is equaled by nothing but their entire devotedness to the will of their leader, with a few who are as destitute of virtue and moral honesty as they are of truth and consistency. As for his book, it is only the counterpart of his money-digging plan. Fearing the penalty of the law and wishing still to amuse his followers, he fled for safety to the sanctuary of pretended religion. Close quote. So there today, as we've quoted from Peggy Fletcher Stack, writing for the Salt Lake Tribune only a few weeks ago, is the reason still to this day why people believe that Joseph was a conniving fraud and that the religion he founded is bogus. All because of the cunning of the devil that they're convinced to. But they don't know the other side. And just as the Mormons have a sugar-coated version, they have a, ought to have a contest to come up with a vinegar version. It's the only thing I can think of now, but later maybe I'll think of a better word. But anyway, there is so much more to understand, of course. You know, how did all these people that were so morally depraved sacrifice so valiantly for the welfare of Zion? How did they do what they did? And how is it that their descendants and those who are following the Mormon side of the story to this day are inspired to do right and walk uprightly before God and to be diligent? Today, they're not known as these indigent, indolent type of morally depraved people. Instead, the creedals have to admit that, oh no, they're good people. But the problem is they're good and virtuous people. I've never known Mormons, any better people than the Mormons. But the problem is they're trying to save themselves by their good works. They don't understand that it's by grace that they have to be saved, and instead they try to save themselves by working righteousness, and so on. The story goes. But anyway, we're out of time, and I've got to go. But we'll maybe continue this next week and look into it further. But in the meantime, I hope you have a good day, and that the Lord's choicest blessings will be with us all, is my prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.